For 1,000 years, Earth was a ghost story. A bedtime myth used to scare misbehaving alien spawn, a cautionary tale about a species that dug too deep and vanished into the void, leaving its scattered colonies to rot. We learned to survive in the shadows, bleeding for a galaxy that openly despised us. But yesterday the ghost came back. Earth ripped its way into real space, and they didn't bring peace. They brought hell, and the galaxy is completely, utterly unprepared. The air in Sector 4 always tasted like pennies and burnt hair. Garrett wiped a streak of black grease across his forehead, leaning back from the access panel. The rusted metal grated against his spine, cold and vibrating with the failing hum of the station's life support. He squeezed his eyes shut. A headache was blooming right behind his temples, a dull, rhythmic throb matching the failing atmospheric scrubbers. "Hand me the hydro spanner," Garrett muttered. His voice was raspy, dry. He hadn't drank actual clean water in 3 days, just the recycled chalky fluid the station overseers called rations. Sullivan grunted from the darkness below him, tossing the heavy iron tool up. Garrett caught it awkwardly. The heavy metal pinched the meat of his palm. He cursed, tasting blood where he'd bitten his own lip. "They're cutting our credits again," Sullivan said. The older man's voice echoed up the narrow maintenance shaft, tired and flat. "Heard the dockmaster talking. Said the Terran quota wasn't met. Said we're getting docked 20%. Garrett jammed the spanner onto a stripped bolt and threw his weight into it. "Let them dock it. What are they going to do, starve us already doing that? Throw us out an airlock, save us the trouble of breathing this battery acid." The bolt broke with a sharp, violent snap. Garrett's knuckles slammed into the bulkhead. He pulled his hand back, watching a line of bright red blood well up against the pale, grime-stained skin. He didn't feel angry. He just felt numb. It was the inheritance of their kind. Terrans, humans, the orphans of the void. 1,000 years ago, the homeworld had just blinked out. No distress signal, no supernova. The entire Sol system had simply vanished behind an impenetrable wall of warped space. The outer colonies, stranded and cut off from their supply lines, had collapsed within decades. Now the descendants of humanity were vermin, cheap labor, scavengers living on the fringes of a galactic society that barely tolerated them. Garrett sucked the blood off his knuckles. The metallic tang mixed with the stale air. "Just patch the bypass." Sullivan coughed a wet, rattling sound that made Garrett's chest tight. Sullivan was dying, lung rot from inhaling too much synthetic coolant. "If we don't get the scrubbers online before the end of the shift, the overseer is going to send the enforcers down here." "I'm patching it," Garrett snapped, wrapping a piece of frayed conductive tape around the wiring. His fingers were numb. "There, done." He kicked the panel shut. The scrubbers groaned a deep mechanical whine, and then a weak, lukewarm breeze drifted down the shaft. It wasn't clean, but it was breathable. Garrett started the long climb down the rusted ladder rungs. His boots clanged hollowly. He hated this station. He hated the sleek insectoid ships that docked here full of fat, wealthy merchants who looked at humans like they were a disease. Most of all, he hated the old stories, the ones Sullivan still whispered when he had too much synthetic gin. Stories about blue skies, about oceans of water you didn't have to filter through charcoal, about Earth. It was a fairy tale for losers. He hit the grated deck beside Sullivan. The older man was leaning against a bundle of pipes, his breath wheezing. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in gray skin. "Good job, kid," Sullivan rasped. Garrett didn't answer. He was reaching for his canteen when the deck dropped beneath them. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The gravity just died, and an instant later it came back with crushing, terrifying force. Garrett's knees slammed into the steel grating. His teeth cracked together so hard he tasted fresh blood. Beside him, Sullivan cried out as his ribs hit the deck. The station's klaxons didn't just wail, they screamed. A high, piercing shriek of absolute system failure. The dim yellow emergency lights flared a blinding, violent red. "What did you do?" Sullivan gasped, clutching his chest. "Nothing." Garrett pushed himself up, his muscles trembling. His inner ear felt like it was full of water. A deep, resonant hum was vibrating through the very molecular structure of the station. It made his skin itch. It made the hairs on his arms stand straight up. "I just wired the bypass, that wasn't me." The comms terminal on the wall burst into a flurry of static. The translation matrix was failing, spitting out garbled alien syntax before finally settling on the harsh clipped tones of the station's automated defense network. "Alert. Spatial rupture detected. Sector 0. Sector 0. Massive gravitational anomaly. All vessels, brace. Sector 0. Garrett froze. Sector 0 wasn't a place. It was a quarantine zone, a dead spot on the galactic map. It was the Sol system. Garrett. Sullivan whispered, his eyes wide and terrified. He was pointing a trembling, grease-stained finger at the small viewport at the end of the corridor. Garrett turned. He walked toward the thick glass, his boots feeling like they were filled with lead. He pressed his face against the cold, condensation-slicked surface and looked out into the void. Space was tearing open. It didn't look like a wormhole. It didn't look like the sleek, engineered slip-space gates the alien trade fleets used. It looked like a wound. The blackness of space was actively hemorrhaging a violent, sickly light. Purple and bruised gold slashed across the star field, jagged and raw. The station's external dampeners were whining, trying to compensate for the tidal forces ripping outward from the tear. Debris from the outer asteroid belt was being sucked inward, vanishing into the blinding light, while other chunks of rock were violently spat out, glowing white-hot. Garrett's breath hitched in his throat. His chest felt impossibly tight. "What is it?" Sullivan asked, dragging himself up against the bulkhead. He couldn't see out the window. "A supernova. A pirate fleet." "No," Garrett said softly. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. It's the quarantine zone, the Veil. For 1,000 years, the space where Earth used to be was surrounded by an opaque, impenetrable energy field. Ships that went in didn't come back. Scanners returned absolute static. The Galactic Council had cordoned it off centuries ago, declaring it a dead sector. But the field wasn't dead anymore. It was shattering. A shockwave of silent, localized gravity hit the station again. The glass of the viewport groaned, spiderweb cracks forming at the edges. Garrett stumbled back instinctively, throwing his arms over his face. The overhead lights flickered, died, and then booted back up on emergency battery power. When Garrett opened his eyes and looked back out the window, the tear in space had stabilized into a massive, jagged maw, and something was coming out of it. The alien dreadnoughts Garrett was used to seeing were elegant things. They were built for efficiency and speed, all curving lines, shimmering energy shields, and seamless biometallic hulls. They looked like silver fish gliding through a black ocean. The thing pulling itself out of the spatial tear was not elegant. It was a brutal, ugly slab of dark, unpolished metal. It didn't glide. It dragged itself forward, forcing the fabric of space to bend around its sheer mass. There were no sleek curves. It was all harsh angles, heavy armor plating, and massive exposed exhaust ports venting streams of superheated plasma. It looked less like a spaceship and more like an iron city that had been ripped from the ground and hurled into the void. It was easily 10 times the size of the station. Garrett Sullivan pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell me what's out there." "A ship," Garrett whispered. He stepped closer to the glass. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird-like flutter. He squinted. The hull of the colossal vessel was scarred. Deep blackened craters marred the thick armor. Sections of the metal were patched with entirely different alloys crudely welded over blast marks. It was a ship that had been at war, not a skirmish, a grinder. As it cleared the tear, the colossal engines flared a violent crimson burn that hurt Garrett's eyes. And there, painted on the side of the forward hull, barely visible beneath a layer of carbon scoring and orbital frost, was a symbol. It wasn't alien script. It wasn't a corporate logo. It was a globe. The continents were fractured, stylized with sharp, aggressive lines, surrounded by a wreath of what looked like rusted chain. Garrett felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. The air in his lungs suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "Sullivan," Garrett said, his voice trembling. He felt sick. A heavy, nauseating knot twisted in his gut. He didn't feel the awe that the old stories promised. He felt a primal, deep-seated terror. It's them. Who? Earth. The word felt foreign in his mouth. Toxic. Before Sullivan could react, the station's intercom squealed with feedback. The automated defense system was overridden. The standard alien warning protocols were wiped out in a fraction of a second. The lights in the corridor stopped flashing red and settled into a harsh, clinical white. A voice echoed through the speakers. It didn't use the translation matrix. It didn't need to. It was speaking standard Terran, the gutter slang Garrett and the other scavengers used, but the accent was hard-clipped and devoid of any emotion. "This is the United Terran Dreadnought, Retribution. To the station authorities, power down your defense grids and open your primary airlocks. Do not attempt to jump. Do not attempt to transmit. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be met with immediate kinetic bombardment. You have 60 seconds. "They're alive," Sullivan breathed, a tear cutting through the grime on his hollow cheek. "The ancestors. They came back." Garrett stared at the massive guns slowly tracking toward the station. They were large enough to swallow a shuttlecraft whole. "They aren't ancestors, old man," Garrett said bitterly. He grabbed his heavy wrench off the deck. "And they didn't come to rescue us." The countdown didn't reach 0. At 40 seconds, the alien station commander, a bloated, six-eyed bureaucrat who governed the outpost from a heavily shielded penthouse, panicked. The station's defensive batteries, a series of weak plasma cannons designed to deter petty pirates, fired a volley at the approaching dreadnought. From the viewport, Garrett watched the streaks of blue plasma impact the hull of the Terran ship. They didn't even flare. The dreadnought didn't have energy shields. The plasma simply splashed against the thick, dark iron armor, leaving nothing but a slight scorch mark. The retaliation was instantaneous. There was no flash of laser light, no high-tech energy beams, just a terrifying physical recoil from one of the dreadnought's secondary batteries. The station shuddered violently. A deafening metallic crack reverberated through the decks, loud enough to burst Garrett's eardrums. He clamped his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees, screaming as a wave of intense pressure squeezed his chest. Down the corridor, the reinforced blast doors leading to the command deck buckled inward. Sparks showered the hallway like a rain of fire. The station's artificial gravity flickered again, throwing dust and loose debris into the air. The Terrans hadn't used plasma. They'd fired a solid slug of dense metal at a fraction of light speed. It had punched straight through the station's command penthouse, obliterating the alien overseer and his entire staff in a millisecond before continuing out the other side into the void. They just gutted the command deck, Garrett stammered, spitting out blood from his bitten tongue. He hauled Sullivan up by his collar. "We need to move, now." "Where?" Sullivan gasped. "There are people, Garrett." "Did you see what they just did?" Garrett yelled, dragging the old man down the corridor away from the outer hull. The smell of burning insulation and ozone was overpowering, choking him. "They don't care who's on this station. They're shooting first." A deep, rhythmic thudding echoed through the station's superstructure. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the docking bays. Boarding pods. They hadn't politely docked. They had slammed directly into the hull, breaching the outer seals with brute force. Garrett dragged Sullivan into an alcove near the main transit hub, hiding behind a row of rusted cargo crates. He clutched his wrench, his knuckles white. The transit hub was usually packed with alien merchants and scavengers. Now it was chaos. Sirens blared. Alien guards armed with sleek pulse rifles were taking cover behind barricades, chattering in panicked clicks and hisses. The main airlock doors at the end of the hall began to glow a violent orange. The metal hissed, then blistered. A split second later, the heavy blast doors were blown inward with explosive force. Smoke, thick and gray, poured into the hub. Garrett held his breath. He peeked through the gap in the crates. Figures stepped through the smoke. They were massive, easily 7 feet tall, clad in heavy scarred combat armor that looked like a walking tank. The armor was matte black, scratched and pitted, reeking of scorched ozone and cold vacuum. There were no sleek visors, just narrow, glowing red optical slits set into heavy iron faceplates. They carried weapons that looked impossibly heavy, boxy rifles fed by thick ammunition belts. The alien guards opened fire. Blue pulse rounds pinged off the Terran armor, doing absolutely nothing. The lead Terran soldier didn't even break stride. He raised his weapon. The sound was deafening, a rapid percussive roar that shook the deck plating. The weapon didn't shoot energy. It shot physical explosive rounds. The alien barricades were shredded in seconds. The guards were torn apart, their sleek armor utterly useless against the kinetic fury of the Terran guns. It was a slaughter. It lasted less than 10 seconds. Silence fell over the hub, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the heavy mechanical breathing of the Terran soldiers. Garrett pressed his back against the crate, squeezing his eyes shut. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. This was Earth. This was humanity. They weren't saviors. They were monsters. Heavy magnetic boots clanked against the deck. The footsteps stopped right in front of Garrett's hiding spot. A massive armored hand reached down, grabbed the heavy cargo crate, and effortlessly threw it aside. Garrett scrambled backward, holding up his wrench in a pathetic defense. Sullivan whimpered, curling into a ball on the floor. The Terran soldier stared down at them, the glowing red optics fixed on Garrett's terrified face. Then on Sullivan. The soldier's weapon lowered slightly. With a hiss of depressurizing seals, the soldier reached up and unlatched his helmet. He pulled it off, revealing a human face. Garrett stopped breathing. The man looked to be in his 40s, but his face was weathered like old leather. A jagged, burn-like scar ran down his jawline. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, and they looked exhausted. There was no triumph in his expression, no joy at finding lost kin, just a cold, calculating pragmatism. He looked like a man who had been fighting since the day he was born and had long ago forgotten why. He looked at Garrett's grimy clothes, the crude wrench in his hand, and the blood on his face. "You're Terran," the man said. His voice was gravelly dry. Garrett swallowed hard. "Yeah, I am Commander Cross, United Terran Expeditionary Force." Cross looked around the ruined transit hub at the dead alien guards, then back to Garrett. "Is this the extent of the local security?" I think so," Garrett stammered. You killed the overseer." "Good." Cross didn't blink. He reached to his belt and pulled out a small metallic cylinder, tossing it at Garrett's feet. It was a localized emergency beacon. "Grab your dead weight," Cross said, gesturing to Sullivan with a nod of his chin. "Follow the beacon path to the breaching pod. You have 10 minutes to get aboard." Garrett stared at the man. What about the rest of the station?" "There are thousands of people here. Indentured workers, families." Cross's expression didn't change. It remained an unreadable mask of stone. "We are only pulling the Terran stock, anyone with human DNA. The rest are consortium assets." "You're just going to leave them?" Garrett's fear was suddenly eclipsed by a bizarre, irrational flash of anger. The aliens treated him like dirt sure, but he'd lived with them his whole life. "The station's life support is failing because of your ship. They'll suffocate." Commander Cross put his helmet back on. The seals locked with a sharp hiss, and the red optics flared to life, casting a bloody glow over Garrett's face. "They aren't our problem." Cross's voice echoed through the helmet speakers, mechanized and cold. "Earth doesn't share anymore. Pack your gear, scavenger. We're burning this rock." The breaching pod didn't fly. It was reeled in like a hooked fish on a heavy magnetic tether. Garrett sat strapped into a rigid metal seat that offered zero padding. The G-force was a physical assault, pressing his ribcage into his lungs until he was taking shallow, desperate sips of air. Next to him, Sullivan's eyes were rolled back in his head, his chest violently heaving. The old man was coughing, spitting thin ropes of bloody phlegm onto the grated floor of the pod. The air in the cramped space smelled heavily of cordite old sweat and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Around them, a dozen other humans from the station's lower decks were strapped in their faces, painted in the harsh, strobing red light of the pod's interior. Nobody was speaking. A few were crying silently, the tears cutting clean tracks through the grease on their faces. They had spent their entire lives praying for the myth of Earth to save them. Now that the myth was here, it felt indistinguishable from a nightmare. The pod slammed into the side of the dreadnought. The impact rattled Garrett's teeth so hard, he bit the inside of his cheek again. Metal groaned against metal, followed by the deafening hiss of atmospheric seals locking into place. The heavy blast doors at the front of the pod didn't slide open. They unlatched with a series of hydraulic thuds and dropped outward like a drawbridge. Cold air rushed in. It wasn't the stale, recycled fart air of the alien station, but it wasn't the sweet blue sky breeze from the bedtime stories either. It was freezing, heavily oxygenated, and carried the unmistakable stench of burning sulfur, hot iron, and synthesized machine oil. It smelled like a foundry. "Unbuckle, move out, leave your dead," the voice barked from a loudspeaker outside the pod. Garrett fumbled with the heavy restraint harness. His fingers were stiff and uncooperative. He finally popped the clasp, immediately turning to Sullivan. The older man was slumping forward, his breath a wet rattle. "Come on, Sully, we're here. We made it," Garrett lied. He hooked an arm under Sullivan's armpit, hauling the frail man up. Sullivan felt like a bag of dry twigs. Garrett dragged him down the ramp and stepped onto the deck of the Retribution. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The docking bay was a cathedral of violence. It was cavernous, stretching out for what looked like miles in either direction, lit by rows of blindingly bright industrial halogen lamps. There were no sleek, curved bulkheads or soft automated voices like on the consortium ships. Everything was exposed. Massive, thick bundles of cabling ran along the ceiling like black veins. Gantry cranes the size of city blocks moved overhead on iron rails, carrying pallets of artillery shells that were easily 3 feet thick. Everywhere Garrett looked, there was motion, but there was no chaos. Hundreds of people were moving across the deck. Mechanics in grease-stained jumpsuits wielding heavy plasma cutters. Loadmasters shouting coordinates. Soldiers in the same scarred black armor that Cross had worn, marching in perfectly synchronized blocks. There was no casual chatter. No one was smiling. The discipline was terrifying, a rigid mechanized order that made the alien station look like a playground. Garrett realized with a sinking stomach that the stories were wrong. Earth hadn't been trapped in a quarantine zone. They had been trapped in a crucible. Whatever they had been doing in the dark for 1,000 years, it had burned away everything soft about them. "Keep moving, scavenger. Form a line by the yellow demarcations." A soldier stepped into Garrett's path. He wasn't wearing his helmet. He looked young, maybe early 20s, but his eyes were ancient and dead. He held a heavy rifle across his chest, his finger resting flat against the trigger guard. "He needs a doctor," Garrett said, his voice cracking. He adjusted his grip on Sullivan, who was currently bleeding through his nose. "He's got lung rot. He needs synth meds." The young soldier looked at Sullivan. There was no pity in his expression. It was the look of a man evaluating a broken machine part. "Medical processing is in Bay 4. Get in the line." The soldier pointed down the massive corridor with the barrel of his rifle. Garrett bit back a curse and dragged Sullivan toward the designated area. The line was a shuffle of misery consisting of the 50-odd humans pulled from Sector 4. They were being corralled by heavily armed guards into a series of chain-link pens. It didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like an intake at a prison camp. As they walked, Garrett looked past the chain-link fences. In the adjacent bay, separated by thick, transparent aluminum, a row of massive boxy dropships were being fueled. Dozens of heavily armored troops were loading into the bays. They weren't stopping with the station. Garrett remembered Cross's words. Earth doesn't share anymore. They were staging for an invasion. The galaxy had spent a millennium treating humans like vermin, ignorant of the fact that the vermin's parents had spent that same millennium turning themselves into apex predators. Garrett. Sullivan wheezed his fingers, digging weakly into Garrett's forearm. "It's cold." "I know. Just hold on. We're almost to the front." They reached a checkpoint manned by personnel in thick rubberized aprons over gray fatigue uniforms. They held scanner wands that looked more like industrial cattle prods. A woman with short-cropped, jagged blonde hair and a scarred lip stepped up to them. She didn't ask for their names. She just jammed the wand against the side of Garrett's neck. A sharp, burning sting flared under his skin, followed by a beep. Subject is uncontaminated. Minimal radiation. She droned, not making eye contact. She looked at Sullivan and pressed the wand to his neck. The machine let out a harsh, flat tone. Subject is corrupted. Severe chemical necrosis in the respiratory tract. Stage 4. She looked up, waving a hand at 2 guards standing nearby. He's scrap. Send him to triage. Wait, what? Garrett tightened his grip on Sullivan as the 2 guards stepped forward. Triage. He just needs a clean air filter and some antibiotics. We don't waste resources on terminal civilians, the woman said flatly. Triage will administer painkillers. Let him go. No. Garrett stepped back, trying to shield the old man. You're our people. You came to save us. One of the guards didn't even speak. He just stepped forward, grabbed Garrett by the collar of his grease-stained shirt, and threw him backward. Garrett hit the iron deck hard, the back of his skull bouncing against the metal. Stars exploded in his vision. Before he could even scramble to his knees, the heavy heel of a magnetic boot planted itself firmly on his chest, pinning him down. He couldn't breathe. He could only watch as the other guard effortlessly scooped Sullivan up like a bundle of laundry and carried him away down a dark side corridor. Garrett! Sullivan's voice was weak, terrified, echoing down the hall before the heavy doors slammed shut. Garrett thrashed, clawing at the boot on his chest, but the guard didn't budge. He just stared down at Garrett with utter indifference. You're a citizen of the Terran Empire now, the woman with the scarred lip said, stepping over Garrett to scan the next shivering refugee in line. Act like it, or you'll go to the incinerator with the rest of the waste. The guard lifted his boot. Garrett rolled over, gasping for air, clutching his bruised chest. The cold reality of the metal deck seeped into his bones. He wasn't saved. He was just under new management. They stripped them. They hosed them down with a chemical solution that smelled of bleach and burned the skin like liquid fire, leaving angry red welts across Garrett's ribs and back. Then they handed out uniforms. The clothing was scratchy, rigid gray canvas. It was devoid of comfort, designed purely for durability. There were no names stitched on the breast, just an alphanumeric sequence stamped in black ink. Garrett's was T-8841. He sat on a hard metal bench in a stark, blindingly white holding room with 30 other scavengers. Some were shivering, staring blankly at the floor. Others were silently weeping. The adrenaline that had kept Garrett moving for the last hour had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. His chest throbbed where the guard had stomped on him. He didn't know if Sullivan was dead yet, but he knew with absolute certainty he was never going to see the old man again. The heavy door at the front of the room hissed open. A man walked in. He wasn't wearing combat armor, just a crisp, dark gray uniform with silver bars on the collar. He looked older than Cross. His hair buzzed completely down to the scalp, a deep network of wrinkles around his eyes. He carried a digital ledger. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The sheer crushing authority in his posture silenced the faint whimpering in the room. I am Logistics Officer Briggs, the man said. His voice was entirely conversational, which somehow made it vastly more terrifying. You have been reclaimed from a hostile alien environment. You have been decontaminated. You have been cataloged. As of this moment, you are property of the United Terran Expeditionary Force. A young woman a few benches down from Garrett stood up. She was trembling, wrapping her arms around herself. Please, she whispered. My daughter. She was on the lower decks of the station. She's only 6. Did you bring her up? Briggs looked at his ledger, swiping a finger across the screen. We extracted 112 viable human assets from the alien structure before we compromised its primary reactor. Garrett's blood ran cold. Compromised its primary reactor. My daughter, the woman repeated, her voice rising in panic. Did you get her? If she is not in this room or Bay 2, she was not retrieved in the allotted window, Briggs said, without looking up. The station was annihilated 10 minutes ago. It is slag. The woman let out a sound that Garrett would never forget. It was a high, broken keen like an animal caught in a trap. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing violently into her hands. Briggs didn't even blink. He waited for her to draw a breath, then continued. You are mourning a life that was already over, Briggs said, his tone devoid of empathy. The galaxy left our ancestors to die. They drew a line around Sol, sealed us in, and waited for us to choke on our own exhaust. We didn't choke. Briggs began to pace slowly at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The quarantine field compressed the Sol system. It trapped our solar radiation. It starved our outer colonies. We had to eat our own worlds to survive. We stripped Mars to the mantle. We shattered the asteroid belts. We harvested the gas giants until they were hollow husks, all to build the engine. Briggs stopped looking directly at Garrett. Do you know what it takes to break a 1,000-year spatial lock scavenger? Garrett just stared at him, numb. It takes the energy of a dying sun, Briggs answered softly. We triggered a localized collapse of our own star to crack the cage. Earth doesn't have a sky anymore. We don't have oceans. We are a fleet. We are a billion souls living in the dark, and we are starving. Garrett felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The mythology was dead. Earth wasn't a paradise waiting to welcome them home. It was a corpse sacrificed by its own children to break out of a prison. The alien civilizations outside the veil have grown fat on our absence. Briggs continued, his voice finally taking on a hard, bitter edge. They have untouched worlds, clean water, mineral wealth. We are taking it, all of it. We are not explorers. We are a locust swarm. Briggs tapped his ledger. You are untrained. You are weak. You are infected with the complacency of alien servitude. But you have Terran blood. You will be sent to the lower decks. You will shovel slag in the foundries. You will load the macro cannons. You will work until you are useful, or you will work until you are dead. Welcome to the war. Briggs turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, locking with a definitive metallic thud. The woman on the floor was still crying. Garrett stared at his shaking hands. The black grease was gone, scrubbed away by the chemical showers, leaving pale, bruised skin. A deep, unnatural vibration began to hum through the floorboards. It wasn't the rattling of failing life support. It was the synchronized waking of massive, unthinkable power. The overhead lights flickered, dimming slightly as the dreadnought diverted power to its primary drive. All hands, a mechanized voice echoed over the PA system. Spooling slipspace rupture, destination consortium core worlds, brace for transit. The vibration intensified until Garrett's teeth rattled in his skull. The air pressure in the room spiked. Garrett closed his eyes. He thought of the rusted dying station. He thought of the alien overseer who docked their pay. He thought of Sullivan thrown away like garbage because he couldn't hold a rifle or turn a wrench. He had hated his old life. He had spent his days looking out into the void, wishing for something to change. The hum reached a deafening crescendo. The ship didn't glide into warp. It violently tore a hole in the fabric of reality and shoved itself through the sheer kinetic force, pinning Garrett to the bench. The galaxy had locked humanity away in the dark. Now the dark had come out. And as the dreadnought plunged into the void heading toward the heart of alien civilization, Garrett finally understood. Earth hadn't returned. Earth was gone. Only the monsters were left. The heat was a physical weight. It sat on Garrett's shoulders, pressing down until his spine ached, curling around his throat like a dry, suffocating hand. They called it Deck 87, the munitions foundry. To Garrett, it was just the belly of the beast. He swung the heavy iron sledgehammer, feeling the shock wave of the impact vibrate up his forearms and rattle his molars. The massive red-hot coupling pin stubbornly slid another fraction of an inch into the breech of the macro cannon assembly. Garrett's gray canvas uniform, issued only 2 days ago, was completely saturated, plastered to his skin, in a foul-smelling layer of black sweat and powdered iron. Hit it again, T-8841. The voice belonged to Cade. Cade was a shift boss. He wasn't a soldier, but he might as well have been. He was built like a cinder block, his left arm ending in a crude, unpainted mechanical prosthetic just below the elbow. He carried a heavy wrench, not to fix machinery, but to crack the ribs of anyone who stopped moving for more than 10 seconds. Garrett didn't speak. He just gritted his teeth, tasting the copper tang of blood where he'd chewed the inside of his cheek raw. He raised the sledgehammer. His muscles screamed. The blisters on his palms had popped hours ago, the raw meat of his hands grinding directly against the wooden handle. He brought the hammer down. Clang! The coupling pin locked. A hiss of pressurized steam vented from the massive pneumatic pipes overhead, spraying Garrett with a mist of boiling oily water. He flinched, turning his face away as the droplets stung his neck. "Lock secured," Cade grunted, marking something on his battered datapad. "Move to loader 4. They're running a shell up from the magazines. It needs guiding." Garrett dropped the hammer. It clattered against the grated deck. He couldn't feel his fingers. He looked at his hands, watching a fresh bead of blood swell and drip from his thumb. He felt a sudden, intense urge to just lie down on the scorching iron floor and close his eyes. Just for a minute. Just let the ship roll over him. A sharp, stinging blow caught him in the center of his back. He stumbled forward, catching himself on a railing, before he pitched face first into an open exhaust vent. "I didn't say rest, scavenger!" Cade barked, his prosthetic claw clicking as he adjusted his grip on his wrench. "Loader 4, now!" Garrett pushed himself off the railing. He didn't look at Cade. If he looked at him, he might swing the hammer, and if he swung the hammer, the guards stationed on the catwalks above would shoot him in the head. It was a simple, brutal math that governed Deck 87. He limped toward the loading track. The foundry was a sprawling subterranean nightmare of industrial violence. Thousands of men and women stripped of their names and reduced to alphanumeric stamps crawled over the massive machinery like ants on the carcass of a steel beast. The noise was absolute. There was no rhythm to it, just a chaotic, overlapping cacophony of grinding gears, roaring furnaces, and the deafening crack of metal on metal. The air was so thick with particulate dust that the halogen lights cut through it in dirty conical beams. Garrett reached loader 4 just as a hydraulic lift groaned upward from the deep magazines. A kinetic artillery shell breached the deck. It was 20 feet long and painted a dull matte black. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like an obelisk. There were no complex guidance fins, no glowing energy cores. It was just a solid, terrifying mass of ultra-dense depleted uranium and tungsten designed to be accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. 4 other conscripts were already wrestling with heavy iron chains, trying to hook the shell to the overhead gantry crane. Garrett recognized one of them, the woman from the processing room, the one who had lost her daughter. She looked 50 years older. Her hair was matted with grease, her eyes sunken into dark, bruised pits. She was struggling to pull a chain link over a heavy iron cleat. Garrett stepped up beside her. He grabbed the chain. The metal was freezing cold, a jarring contrast to the suffocating heat of the room. "Pull!" He rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. She didn't look at him, but she leaned her weight into it. Together, they dragged the heavy chain over the cleat, locking the massive shell into the hoist cradle. "Hoist clear!" someone shouted down the line. The gantry motor screamed in protest, lifting the 20-ton shell off the hydraulic pad and sliding it toward the dark, gaping maw of the macro cannon breech. Garrett stood back, wiping sweat from his eyes with the back of a filthy wrist. He watched the shell disappear into the barrel. He thought about the alien station. He thought about Sector 4. The air had been bad and the rations were chalky, but he hadn't spent his days building tools of mass extinction. He had been a mechanic. He had fixed scrubbers so people could breathe. Now he was just a muscle fiber in a machine designed exclusively to kill. The woman beside him swayed. Her knees buckled and she collapsed against the iron railing, coughing violently. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a deep, wet hacking that brought up dark spots of blood onto her chin. Garrett stepped forward, instinctively reaching out. Hey, sit down. Just breathe shallow." Cade's heavy boots rang out against the grating. He rounded the corner, his eyes narrowing at the woman on the floor. "Get up T419, Cade ordered. "She's sick," Garrett said, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and a sudden sharp spike of anger. "She inhaled exhaust from the plasma cutters. She needs water." Cade looked at Garrett, his expression completely blank. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, bored even. He reached down, wrapped his flesh hand in the collar of the woman's uniform, and hauled her to her feet with zero effort. "The ship doesn't care if you're sick," Cade said, looking directly into the woman's terrified, glassy eyes. "The ship only cares if you're pulling the chain." "Are you pulling the chain?" She nodded weakly, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. Cade let her go. She slumped against the rail, gasping. He turned his dead eyes to Garrett. "You think you're the first one to feel sorry for someone on this deck, scavenger?" Cade stepped closer. He smelled like stale sweat and chewing tobacco. "Look around you. Every soul on this ship is dying. The ones in the officers' mess, the ones in the pilot seats, the ones shoveling slag. We gave up our home. We gave up our son. We gave up our humanity a long time ago. All that's left is the momentum." He poked Garrett hard in the chest with a thick, calloused finger. "So stop pretending you're a savior. You're just a battery. Bleed until you're dry, then we'll throw you in the furnace and find another one." Cade turned and walked away, barking at a crew of loaders down the line. Garrett stood perfectly still. The vibrations of the ship rattled through the soles of his boots. He looked at his blistered hands. He looked at the massive black gun barrel. He wasn't Garrett anymore. He was T-8841, and he was going to help them burn the galaxy down. The klaxons didn't just sound, they tore the air apart. It was a dual-toned scream so loud it made Garrett's inner ear ache. The harsh industrial halogen lights of the munitions deck instantly cut out, replaced by a strobing violent blood red. A digitized voice cut through the blare. Slipspace transition in T-30 seconds. All batteries load kinetic. Target designated Consortium Core World Ethelgard. Orbital bombardment protocols engaged. Panic raw and primal spiked in Garrett's chest. The deck suddenly felt like it was tilting. "Lock the chains," Cade roared over the sirens, his voice amplified by a handheld comms unit. "Secure the breach seals. If those shells slip during transit, they'll crush you into paste." Garrett scrambled toward the massive gun assembly. The woman with the bloody cough T-419 was fumbling with the heavy locking levers on the side of the breach. Her hands were shaking too violently to engage the heavy iron pins. Garrett shoved her aside, throwing his weight against the lever. It was incredibly stiff. He braced his boot against the housing and pushed with everything he had left. The lever groaned, then slammed into place with a definitive click. "Clear the loading zone," Cade screamed. Garrett grabbed T-419 by the arm and dragged her backward into the narrow trench that ran alongside the gun track. They threw themselves flat against the freezing metal grate, covering their heads. The ship shuddered. It wasn't a gentle deceleration. The Retribution didn't gracefully exit slipspace. It violently tore its way back into reality. Gravity inverted for a terrifying second. Garrett's stomach slammed into his throat. He felt weightless, hovering an inch above the grate, and then gravity slammed back down with crushing force. His chin hit the metal floor hard enough to chip a tooth. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him. The massive steel plates of the ship groaned a deep, whale-like sound of metal under unimaginable stress. They were out. They were in consortium space. Transition complete, the PA system droned utterly devoid of emotion. Local defense fleet detected. Firing solution acquired. Garrett opened his eyes. The red emergency lights cast long, demonic shadows across the foundry. "Stand by on loaders," Cade yelled, pacing the trench. Garrett didn't want to stand up. He wanted to melt into the floor. He wanted to be anywhere but inside this flying slaughterhouse. But his body betrayed his terror. His muscles, driven by a desperate animal instinct to avoid a beating, pushed him to his feet. On the massive tactical display screen suspended above the central gantry, the view from the ship's exterior optics flared to life. Ethelgard. Garrett had only heard rumors of the core worlds. They were supposed to be jewels in the blackness. The screen showed a massive, beautiful sphere of deep azure oceans and sweeping continents of vibrant emerald green. It was completely wrapped in a delicate shimmering web of orbital stations and defensive platforms. Sleek silver consortium cruisers were already breaking formation, streaking toward the Retribution like angry hornets. They looked beautiful, elegant, advanced. "Engage primary batteries," the PA ordered. The deck dropped. Garrett's knees buckled. A sound unlike anything he had ever heard ripped through the ship. It was a physical blow, a concussive shockwave that forced all the air out of his lungs in a single violent rush. The entire dreadnought recoiled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in a thick gray curtain. The macro cannon beside Garrett had fired. He stared at the tactical screen, his vision blurring. There were no glowing lasers. No dramatic space battles of dodging and weaving. The dreadnought's kinetic kill vehicles simply crossed the void at terminal velocity. A sleek consortium cruiser thousands of miles away simply ceased to exist. It didn't explode in a fireball. The sheer kinetic impact of the depleted uranium shell struck the energy shields, shattered them in a microsecond, and hit the hull with the force of a tectonic plate. The silver ship shattered into a million pieces of invisible shrapnel, instantly vaporized by the friction of the impact. "Loader!" Cade screamed, hitting Garrett in the shoulder with his wrench. "Breach is open, ram the next shell!" Garrett jolted out of his stupor. The massive breech block of the cannon hissed open, venting a cloud of scorching smoke that smelled like burnt ozone and vaporized steel. He ran to the hydraulic lift, hauling on the chains with the other conscripts. They dragged the next 20-ton obelisk onto the rail. The heat radiating from the open gun barrel was intense enough to singe Garrett's eyebrows. He couldn't breathe. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of noise and smoke. Boom! Another battery fired. The ship shook violently. Garrett lost his footing, his knees slamming into the grating. He looked up at the screen. The Consortium defense fleet was in ruins. Their plasma weapons were splashing harmlessly against the Retribution's impossibly thick iron armor. The Terran ship wasn't maneuvering. It was just taking the hits and methodically, brutally punching holes in anything that moved. Orbital defenses neutralized, the PA announced. Target lock on primary population centers. Prepare planetary bombardment. Garrett froze. His hands slipped off the greasy chain. Population centers. Cities. He stared at the beautiful blue and green marble on the screen. It wasn't a military base. It was a homeworld. Billions of lives. Civilians. Children. "What are we doing?" Garrett whispered, the sound completely lost in the roar of the machinery. "Load the gun T-8841, Cade roared, stepping up and grabbing Garrett by the collar. He hauled him back toward the shell. "Load it! They're cities!" Garrett yelled back, his voice cracking, tearing his throat. "We're shooting at cities!" Cade didn't blink. He slammed Garrett back against the heavy iron shell. "They let us rot in the dark for 1,000 years!" Cade screamed, spittle flying from his lips, hitting Garrett in the face. "They knew we were starving. They watched us eat our own planet. Now it's their turn to burn. Load the damn gun." Garrett looked at Cade's face. Beneath the dirt, beneath the rage, there was a profound, bottomless grief. A madness born from a millennium of suffering. They couldn't be saved because they didn't want salvation. They wanted revenge. Garrett looked down at his blistered, bleeding hands. He looked at T-419, who was weeping silently as she pulled on the chain, too terrified to stop. The ship shuddered as enemy plasma fire hammered the hull above them. The red lights strobed. Garrett closed his eyes. The moral high ground didn't exist here. There was only the gun and the void. He turned, grabbed the freezing iron chain, and pulled. The shell slid into the breach. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the fate of 1,000,000 souls below. The deck dropped again, and the iron rain fell on Ethelgard. The bombardment didn't end with a dramatic final shot. It ended with a slow, agonizing crawl, winding down like a dying clock. Garrett didn't know how long they had been firing. 2 hours. 10 time on deck 87 didn't exist. There was only the heat, the deafening roar of the macro cannon, and the relentless, agonizing pull of the heavy iron chains. His shoulder muscles felt like torn meat. His throat was so parched it was producing a thick, copper-tasting paste every time he tried to swallow. Cease fire. Main batteries stand down. Cooling sequence initiated. The PA system's automated voice was the loudest thing Garrett had ever heard, simply because it was immediately followed by an absolute crushing silence. The heavy pneumatic loaders hissed, locking into their neutral positions. The massive breech of the cannon remained open, venting a continuous low stream of white-hot steam. Garrett let go of the chain. His hands didn't want to unclench. The joints in his fingers had locked up cramped and trembling, molded to the shape of the iron links. He forced them open, wincing, as the raw, blistered skin pulled away from the freezing metal. He staggered backward, his boots slipping on the deck. It was slick. A mixture of hydraulic fluid condensation and the blood from a dozen exhausted conscripts who had pushed themselves until their noses bled from the pressure spikes. Garrett hit the safety railing and leaned against it, his chest heaving. He couldn't hear himself breathing. A high, continuous ringing whined in his ears, blocking out the ambient hum of the dreadnought's core. He looked up at the tactical screen hanging over the central gantry. The vibrant blue and green marble of Ethelgard was gone. In its place hung a bruised, broken sphere. Massive, jagged impact craters glowing with the dull, angry red of exposed magma scarred the continents. The atmosphere, once a pristine azure, was choked with swirling violent storm fronts of dense black ash. It looked like a rotting piece of fruit, bruised and split open. There were no glowing energy fields left. No silver defense fleets. Just a graveyard of debris orbiting a dying world. Down the trench, T-419 collapsed. She didn't fall gracefully. She just folded inward like a puppet, with its strings cut her knees, hitting the grated floor with a sickening hollow thud. She didn't try to get back up. She lay on her side, her chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged spasms. Her eyes were fixed on the dark ceiling, wide and completely vacant. Garrett took a step toward her, but his leg wouldn't bear his weight. He slid down the railing, hitting the deck hard, his legs sprawling out in front of him. He looked for Cade. The shift boss was standing by the primary hydraulic lift. The heavy wrench he used to threaten and beat them hung loosely in his mechanical hand. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pacing. Cade was staring up at the tactical screen, his face bathed in the sickly red glow of the ruined planet. For the first time since Garrett had met him, Cade looked old. The terrifying mechanized monster of a man was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. There was no victory in his pale eyes, no triumph. He looked like a man who had just dug a grave, only to realize he had to dig a billion more. A heavy static-laced click echoed over the PA system. The automated voice was gone. This time, it was a live broadcast. "This is Fleet Admiral Cole to all decks." The voice was remarkably calm. It sounded like a man reading a weather report. "Primary targets neutralized. Atmospheric dust saturation is at 82%. Ethelgard's planetary surface is currently uninhabitable. Extraction teams deploy to the polar ice caps. We need the water. Mining vessels prep for atmospheric descent. Strip the major cities for refined alloys. You have 48 hours before the consortium mobilization fleet arrives. Leave nothing behind." Garrett stared at the deck grating between his boots. They weren't staying. They weren't occupying. They were going to land suck the dying planet dry of whatever water and metal survived the kinetic bombardment and move on. Briggs had been right. They weren't a civilization anymore. They were a swarm of locusts. "Get up." Cade's voice was barely a whisper, gravelly and dry. Garrett looked up. The shift boss was walking down the line, nudging the exhausted, shell-shocked conscripts with the toe of his heavy boot. "Cooling sequence takes 4 hours, Cade said, not looking at any of them. "Grab the slag shovels. The breaches need to be cleared of carbon buildup before the next jump. Move." Garrett didn't move. He felt a sudden heavy pressure building behind his eyes. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pick up the heavy iron sledgehammer and cave Cade's skull in. He wanted to shatter the tactical screen. He wanted the universe to make sense. "I said get up T-8841. Cade stopped in front of Garrett. Garrett looked up at the shift boss. "We killed them all, whole cities, for water, for survival," Cade corrected, his voice flat. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at Garrett's chest. "You think they would have treated us any different? You lived on their station, scavenger. You know what they think of us. If we knocked on their door and asked for a cup of water, they would have glassed our ships from orbit." Cade leaned in the smell of old sweat and copper overpowering. "The galaxy is a dark forest, kid. The only way to survive the dark is to be the scariest thing in it. Now get up, or I'll throw you in the furnace myself." Garrett stared into Cade's dead eyes. He searched for a lie. He searched for some hidden reservoir of guilt or hesitation. There was nothing. Just the cold, terrifying pragmatism of a species that had stared into the abyss for 1,000 years and decided to eat it. Garrett put a trembling hand on the railing. He pushed himself up. His joints screamed, but he found his footing. He walked over to the rack on the wall and pulled down a heavy, flat-nosed iron shovel. The next 48 hours were a blur of mindless, agonizing repetition. Garrett shoveled thick black carbon soot from the mouth of the macro cannon. The soot was still hot, radiating a dry, choking heat that baked his face and filled his lungs with an oily residue. The air scrubbers on Deck 87 were overwhelmed. The foundry smelled perpetually of burnt hair and vaporized uranium. They were given one ration break, 10 minutes. A heavily armed guard handed Garrett a dented aluminum canteen filled with lukewarm recycled water and a square of compressed gray protein paste that tasted like cardboard and salt. Garrett choked it down his stomach, protesting violently, but he kept it down. He needed the calories. He needed the strength. He didn't speak to the other conscripts. They didn't speak to him. T-419 had been hauled away by the medical automated drones hours ago. Garrett didn't know if they had taken her to triage or directly to the incinerators. He found that he didn't have the energy to care. It was a terrifying realization. The empathy that had defined him on the alien station, the instinct that had made him drag old Sullivan to the breaching pod, was burning away layer by layer in the oppressive heat of the foundry. He was adapting. He hated himself for it, but he was adapting. On the massive screens above the dreadnought's exterior, cameras showed the extraction fleet returning. Hundreds of brutal box-like cargo ships rose from the black clouds of Ethelgard. They didn't look like human ships of old. They were ugly, functional things, their hulls bulging with harvested resources. They brought millions of gallons of dirty, irradiated water from the melting ice caps, chunks of raw steel stripped from the ruins of the alien cities, and whatever consortium technology they could rip from the rubble. It was a harvest of misery. The ships docked. The cargo was fed directly into the dreadnought's sprawling refineries on the lower decks. The water would be boiled, scrubbed, and filtered. The steel would be melted down and forged into more kinetic shells. The dreadnought was a closed-loop system of destruction. It fed on the dead to create more death. "Secure your stations!" Cade's voice boomed over the localized comms, cutting through the heavy mechanical grinding of the deck. "Extraction is complete. The fleet is spooling up. Secure the breech locks and brace." Garrett dropped his shovel. It clattered loudly against the deck. He didn't wait for a second order. He moved with a stiff, bruised urgency, grabbing the heavy locking lever on the cannon breech and slamming it home. He didn't run to the trench this time. He just leaned against the cold iron of the gun, housing his breath, coming in shallow, measured rasps. He looked at his hands. The blisters from 2 days ago had popped, bled, and dried. The skin underneath was already hardening, forming thick, yellowed calluses. The black grease and iron dust were worked deep into his pores, staining his skin permanently. He looked like the metal he had been moving. All hands, the mechanized voice echoed. Slipspace rupture spooling. Destination Consortium Industrial Hub, Viridia Prime. Brace for transit. Viridia Prime. Another world, another blue sky to burn. Garrett closed his eyes. He didn't feel the paralyzing fear he had felt during the first jump. He just felt a deep, heavy exhaustion. The galaxy had told stories about Earth for 1,000 years. They had warned their children about the ghosts in the quarantine zone. But they had misunderstood the danger. They thought Earth was a trap. They didn't realize it was a forge. Humanity hadn't survived the isolation by clinging to their ideals. They hadn't written poetry or built grand philosophies in the dark. They had built an engine. They had stripped away everything that made them soft, everything that made them merciful, until only the sheer naked will to exist remained. They were no longer explorers or diplomats. They were an apex predator, unleashed into a galaxy that had forgotten what real, unrestricted violence looked like. The deck began to vibrate. The deep rhythmic thudding of the primary drive core resonated through the soles of Garrett's boots, traveling up his spine and vibrating in his teeth. The emergency lights flared a blinding red. The massive dreadnought, pregnant with the stolen oceans of a dead world, ripped a hole in the fabric of space and shoved itself violently into the void. Garrett opened his eyes and stared at the empty loading track. He knew what was coming next. The alarms would scream, the deck would drop, the iron rain would fall again. He reached out his calloused fingers, finding the heavy freezing iron of the drag chain. He gripped it tight, taking a deep breath of the foul, ozone-laced air. He was T-8841. He was a citizen of the Terran Empire, and he was ready to pull. And that concludes our journey into the dark, brutal return of humanity. If this gritty, unapologetic take on HFY kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. It shows us what kind of stories you want to see more of. Do you think Garrett lost his humanity completely? Or is he just doing what it takes to survive the Terran war machine? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers and subscribe to the channel for more epic, grounded stories from the darkest corners of the galaxy.